The radio crackled with static over the Hindu Kush mountains, carrying a voice that shouldn't have existed. Dead men don't make emergency calls, yet here was Bravo Team, officially KIA 72 hours ago, requesting immediate close air support. The transmission lasted exactly 14 seconds before cutting to silence, leaving only coordinates that placed them deep in Taliban-controlled territory where no American forces were supposed to be. Major Catalina Ghost, Restrepo banked her. Thunderbolt II through the pre-dawn darkness, the twin turbofans humming their familiar death song. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon beneath her cockpit held 1,174 rounds of 30 depleted uranium, each one capable of turning an insurgent into pink mist. But numbers meant nothing when you couldn't find your target. Bagram Tower, this is Warthog 7, she transmitted, her voice steady despite the impossible situation. I have no visual on friendly forces. Repeat, no visual confirmation on Bravo Team's position. The response came through layers of command bureaucracy, each voice more skeptical than the last. Bravo Team was dead. Satellite imagery confirmed their convoy had been vaporized by an IED outside Jalalabad. Yet someone was using their call signs, their encryption codes, their voices. Someone who knew exactly how to sound like Staff Sergeant Marcus Rivera, the team leader who'd grown up 3 blocks from Catalina's childhood home in East LA. Ghost, this is Colonel Hartwell, came the transmission from Bagram. You're chasing phantoms, RTB immediately. Catalina's gloved hand tightened on the stick. 23 years of military service had taught her to follow orders, but something deeper, call it instinct, call it desperation, kept her aircraft pointed toward the coordinates. The Pratt & Whitney turbofans pushed her through thin mountain air at 420 knots, while below, the landscape stretched like a moonscape of ancient valleys and snow-capped peaks that had swallowed armies for millennia. She'd earned her call sign Ghost not for stealth, but for her uncanny ability to appear when others had given up hope. In Iraq, she'd found a downed Apache crew that even the satellites had written off. In Syria, she'd extracted a special forces team from a compound that officially didn't exist. But this felt different. This felt personal. The A-10's targeting pod swept the terrain in infrared, searching for heat signatures among the rocks and shadows. Nothing. Just the cold, hostile landscape of Afghanistan's eastern frontier, where the only movement came from wind-blown snow and the occasional mountain goat. Yet somewhere down there, if the impossible transmission was real, American warriors were dying while she flew blind circles overhead. The fuel gauge showed 3 hours of flight time remaining. 3 hours to solve a mystery that had already claimed 8 lives, or 9, if you counted the reputation she'd sacrificed by disobeying direct orders. But Catalina Restrepo hadn't survived 2 decades of military service by playing it safe. She'd survived by trusting her instincts, even when they led her into the impossible. Especially when they led her into the impossible. Her father had been a crop duster in the San Joaquin Valley, teaching her to read the sky before she could read books. Mija, he'd say, the sky tells truth when everything else lies. Now, banking through the thin air at 15,000 feet, she listened to what the sky was telling her. The terrain below held secrets, and secrets cast shadows, even in darkness. The A-10 systems hummed with electronic precision. The Maverick missiles hung heavy on their pylons, while the targeting computer painted digital crosshairs across her heads-up display. But technology could only do so much. Sometimes you needed more than sensors and satellites. Sometimes you needed faith. Bravo Team, this is Warthog 7, she transmitted on the emergency frequency. If you can hear me, give me something to work with, anything. Silence stretched across the void, filled only by the whisper of wind across her canopy and the steady rhythm of her breathing inside the oxygen mask. Below, Afghanistan slept fitfully, dreaming its ancient dreams of conquest and resistance. Above, the stars wheeled in their eternal dance, indifferent to the human drama playing out in the thin air between earth and heaven. Then, faint as a dying heartbeat, came a single flash of light from a valley she'd already searched twice. Just a momentary flicker, gone so quickly she almost convinced herself it was imagination. Almost. But Catalina Restrepo had spent her career learning to distinguish between hope and reality, and that flash, barely visible, desperately brief, carried the unmistakable signature of American military equipment. A strobe light, standard issue survival gear, blinking once every 10 seconds in the universal pattern that meant American forces in distress. She'd found them. Or they'd found her. The valley stretched like a knife wound between two ridgelines, narrow enough that her A-10's 57-foot wingspan would barely clear the peaks on either side. Flying into that terrain would violate every rule of close air support. You never descended into unknown territory without ground coordination, never exposed yourself to ambush in confined spaces, never risked a multi-million-dollar aircraft for unconfirmed targets. But rules were written by people who'd never heard dead men calling for help. "Bagram Tower, this is Warthog 7, she transmitted, knowing the response would be immediate and predictable. "I have possible visual contact with friendly forces. Grid reference 34 degrees 3412 N, 70 degrees 847 E. Requesting permission to investigate." The silence that followed lasted exactly 17 seconds, long enough for her to complete a full tactical assessment of the terrain below. The valley was a perfect kill zone, with elevated positions on three sides and only one viable escape route. If the Taliban had set a trap, they'd chosen their ground well. If Bravo team was really down there, they were sitting in hell's front parlor. "Negative, Warthog 7, came Hartwell's voice, sharp with authority. "That grid reference is inside known enemy territory. You are ordered to RTB immediately." Catalina studied her fuel gauge again. 2 hours and 43 minutes of flight time remaining. Enough to investigate the valley and still make it back to Bagram, assuming she didn't encounter resistance, assuming the weather held, assuming a dozen variables that could kill her faster than enemy fire. The strobe flashed again, perfectly timed, exactly where American training said it should be. Whoever was down there knew the protocols, knew the equipment, knew how to survive in hostile territory long enough to call for help. The question wasn't whether they were Americans. The question was whether they were still alive. Her decision came with the certainty that had carried her through 23 years of military service, from her first training flight over the Mojave Desert to combat missions over 3 different war zones. Some choices couldn't be made by committee, couldn't be processed through chains of command, couldn't wait for perfect information. Some choices came down to the fundamental question that separated warriors from bureaucrats. Are you willing to risk everything to save someone else? The answer for Catalina Restrepo had always been the same. She pushed the stick forward and dove toward the valley, her A-10's engines singing their lethal song as she descended into the unknown. The altimeter unwound rapidly, 12,000 feet, 10,000, 8,000, while the terrain rushed up to meet her with geological indifference. If this was a trap, she was flying straight into it. If this was a rescue, she was already too late. But if there was even a chance that American warriors were down there, bleeding and dying while she flew safe circles overhead, then she'd rather face a court-martial than live with the alternative. The A-10 Thunderbolt II was built to take punishment and keep fighting, designed around the massive GAU-8 cannon that gave it the nickname Warthog. It wasn't pretty, wasn't fast, wasn't sophisticated, but it was tough as old leather and twice as mean, perfect for close air support missions where pilots flew low and slow through the worst kind of hell. Perfect for someone like Catalina, who'd learned long ago that sometimes the only way out was through. At 5,000 feet above ground level, she began her tactical assessment of the valley floor. The terrain was classic Afghanistan, rocks, dust, and death waiting behind every shadow. Her targeting pod swept left and right, painting the landscape in infrared signatures while her radar searched for threats. Nothing. Just empty space and the occasional heat bloom from rocks still cooling from the day's sun. Then she saw them. 8 figures in desert camouflage, arranged in a defensive perimeter around what looked like the wreckage of an up-armored Humvee. One figure was moving, adjusting the strobe light that had caught her attention. The others lay perfectly still in positions that spoke of discipline, training, and the kind of tactical awareness that kept soldiers alive in hostile territory. These weren't insurgents playing games with captured equipment. These were American warriors, and they were in serious trouble. The radio crackled with an incoming transmission, close range and desperate. "Warthog 7, this is Bravo Actual. Jesus Christ, we thought you'd never find us." The voice belonged to Staff Sergeant Marcus Rivera, no question about it. She'd know that East LA accent anywhere, had heard it in a dozen different combat zones over the past 5 years. But Marcus Rivera was supposed to be dead, along with the rest of his team, victims of an IED attack that had been confirmed by satellite imagery and drone surveillance. Dead men don't call for close air support. Dead men don't operate strobes with perfect military precision. Dead men don't know her personal call sign or speak with voices she'd recognize in her sleep. Yet here was Bravo Team, 8 American warriors trapped in a valley that wasn't supposed to contain any friendly forces, calling for help with voices that shouldn't exist. The contradiction would have to wait. Right now, 8 Americans needed her, and that was the only truth that mattered. "Bravo Actual, this is Ghost," she replied, using the call sign that Marcus had given her during their first mission together in Iraq. "What's your situation?" The response came quickly, professionally, with the kind of tactical brevity that marked experienced operators. 8 souls, 3 wounded, vehicle disabled, surrounded by approximately 40 enemy combatants with RPGs and small arms. "We've been here 72 hours with no resupply. Request immediate CAS and medical evacuation." 40 insurgents with rocket-propelled grenades. The numbers were getting worse by the minute. Her A-10 carried enough ordnance to level a city block, but close air support in confined terrain required surgical precision, not brute force. One miscalculation, one targeting error, one malfunction, and she'd be dropping high explosives on the very people she'd come to save. "Bravo Actual, I need you to mark your position with IR strobes," she transmitted, beginning her attack run preparation. "Friendlies to the north, threats to the south, east, and west. Confirm your exact location." As she spoke, her hands moved across the weapon systems with practiced efficiency. Master arm switched to armed position, target selection to Maverick missiles, laser designator to standby. The A-10 systems responded with electronic precision, transforming 23,000 pounds of aircraft into a flying weapons platform designed for one purpose: close air support for ground forces in contact with the enemy. The infrared strobes appeared on her targeting display like digital fireflies, marking friendly positions with the geometric precision of American military doctrine. Everything looked legitimate, felt right, matched the tactical situation described in Marcus's transmission. But the nagging question remained: how were dead men calling for help from a valley they'd never reached? The answer would have to wait. Right now, Bravo Team was under fire, and she had work to do. Her first target was a cluster of heat signatures positioned on the valley's eastern ridge, elevated terrain that gave them perfect overwatch on Bravo Team's defensive perimeter. The Maverick missile locked onto the largest signature, probably a machine gun position, and she squeezed the trigger without hesitation. The missile departed its rail with a puff of smoke and a low rumble, tracking toward the target on its own internal guidance system. Impact came 3 seconds later, a brilliant flash followed by secondary explosions that lit up her infrared display like the 4th of July. Enemy ammunition cooking off in the heat, probably an entire weapons cache hidden in the rocks. One threat eliminated, 39 to go. "Good hit, Ghost," came Marcus's voice over the radio, filled with the kind of professional appreciation that marked a true warrior. Enemy concentration approximately 200 meters south of our position, behind the large boulder formation. She banked left and acquired the new target, her second Maverick already locked and loaded. The boulder formation showed multiple heat signatures, fighters moving with tactical discipline as they tried to flank Bravo team's position. These weren't untrained insurgents stumbling around in the dark. These were experienced combatants who knew their business, understood the terrain, and had enough patience to siege American forces for 3 days without making critical mistakes. The second missile eliminated another 4 signatures, leaving 35 enemies still in the fight. Math was working in her favor, but ammunition wasn't unlimited. 2 Mavericks down, 2 remaining, plus the GAU-8 cannon with enough rounds for approximately 17 seconds of sustained fire. Enough to break the siege, probably, but not enough for mistakes. Her radio crackled with an incoming transmission from Bagram Tower, Colonel Hartwell's voice tight with authority and barely controlled anger. Warthog 7, you are ordered to cease combat operations and return to base immediately. You are engaging targets without proper authorization in violation of rules of engagement. Catalina ignored the transmission and lined up her third attack run, this time using the 30 cannon instead of missiles. The GAU-8 Avenger was designed to destroy Soviet tanks, capable of firing 3,900 rounds per minute with muzzle velocities that could punch through armor like tissue paper. Against human targets, the results would be devastating, decisive, and completely final. Bravo Actual, heads down for gun run, she transmitted, beginning her dive toward the valley floor. The A-10 descended through 3,000 feet, 2,000, 1,500, until she was low enough to see individual fighters scrambling for cover behind rocks and equipment. Low enough to see muzzle flashes from their weapons, tracer rounds reaching up toward her aircraft like deadly fireworks. Low enough to smell the cordite and fear that marked every close air support mission. The cannon spoke with the voice of industrial death, sending streams of depleted uranium through the morning air at 3,900 rounds per minute. The sound was distinctive, unmistakable, like a giant zipper being closed at supersonic speed, followed by impacts that turned solid rock into powder and human beings into memories. 5 seconds of sustained fire eliminated another 8 targets, reducing enemy strength to 27 combatants. Outstanding work, Ghost. Marcus's voice carried relief and professional admiration in equal measure. Enemy forces withdrawing to prepared positions on the western slope. We have movement, approximately 15 individuals breaking contact. She gained altitude and surveyed the tactical situation through her targeting pod. The siege was broken, enemy morale was collapsing, and Bravo team was still intact in their defensive perimeter. A successful close air support mission by any standard, except for the small detail that none of it should have been possible. Dead men don't call for help. Dead men don't coordinate with A-10 pilots using proper military protocol. Dead men don't know her personal call sign or speak with voices she'd recognize across a crowded room. But live Americans needed evacuation, and that was a problem she could solve. Bagram Tower, this is Warthog 7, she transmitted, knowing the response would be immediate and furious. I have 8 American personnel requiring immediate medical evacuation. Grid reference 34 degrees 3412, N, 70 degrees 847 E. 3 wounded, vehicle disabled, enemy contact broken. The silence that followed lasted exactly 11 seconds, long enough for her to begin calculating fuel consumption and flight time back to Bagram. She had enough aviation gas for 1 hour and 27 minutes of flight operations, sufficient for combat air patrol over the extraction site until medical helicopters arrived. Sufficient to complete the mission, face the inevitable court-martial, and accept whatever consequences came with disobeying direct orders to save American lives. Warthog 7, you are in violation of direct orders, came Hartwell's voice, cold as winter in Montana. Return to base immediately or face charges of insubordination. Catalina studied the tactical display one more time, confirming that all enemy signatures had either been eliminated or withdrawn from effective range. Bravo team was secure, the immediate threat was neutralized, and medical evacuation was possible. Mission accomplished by any reasonable standard. Mission accomplished, except for the impossible fact that she just saved 8 Americans who were supposed to be dead. "Colonel, with respect," she replied, "I have Americans on the ground who need medical attention. I'm not leaving them." The transmission that followed would end her military career. She knew that with absolute certainty. 23 years of service, an unblemished record, citations for valor in 3 different combat zones. All of it would be sacrificed for 8 men she'd found by following a single flash of light in hostile territory. But some choices were bigger than careers, bigger than regulations, bigger than personal consequences. Some choices came down to the fundamental promise that every American warrior made to every other: no one gets left behind. The medical evacuation helicopters appeared on her radar 12 minutes later, 2 A-60 Black Hawks escorted by a pair of A-64 Apache gunships. Professional, competent, properly equipped for dust-off operations in hostile territory. The kind of response that Marcus Rivera's team deserved. The kind of support that every American warrior counted on when things went sideways in bad places. "Ghost, this is Dust-Off 7, came the transmission from the lead Black Hawk. "We have your location, 8 souls for extraction. What's the tactical situation?" She provided a detailed briefing while maintaining combat air patrol overhead, describing enemy positions, terrain hazards, and the specific medical needs of the wounded personnel. Professional, thorough, by the book, exactly the kind of coordination that kept everyone alive during high-risk operations. The fact that none of it should have been possible was a problem for intelligence analysts and command staff. Her job was keeping American warriors alive long enough to get home. The extraction proceeded with military efficiency. 8 soldiers loaded onto medical helicopters, wounded personnel receiving immediate care, equipment secured according to protocol. Standard operating procedure for personnel recovery in hostile territory, except for the voices she recognized and the faces that belonged to men who were supposed to be dead. Staff Sergeant Marcus Rivera was the last man loaded onto the Black Hawk, and he looked exactly the same as she remembered from their last mission together 6 months earlier. Same eyes, same scar along his left jaw from an IED fragment in Fallujah, same East LA attitude that had carried him through 3 combat deployments. The only difference was that according to official records, he'd been killed in action 72 hours ago along with the rest of his team. "Thanks, Ghost," he said over the radio as the medical helicopter lifted off. "We owe you one." The transmission ended, and Catalina was alone again in the Afghan sky, flying combat air patrol over an empty valley while her fuel gauge counted down the minutes until she'd have to face the consequences of her decision. 1 hour and 3 minutes of flight time remaining. 1 hour and 3 minutes before the court-martial, the end of her career, and whatever answers waited at Bagram Air Base. But 8 American warriors were going home alive, and that was worth whatever price she'd have to pay. The flight back to Bagram passed in electronic silence, her A-10 systems humming their familiar song while Afghanistan scrolled past beneath her wings. The same landscape that had swallowed armies for centuries, the same ancient peaks and valleys that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires. Nothing had changed, except that somewhere in those mountains, 8 Americans had cheated death and lived to fight another day. The radio remained ominously quiet until she entered Bagram's airspace, then exploded with activity as ground control directed her to a remote parking area away from normal flight operations. Standard procedure for aircraft returning from unauthorized combat missions. Standard procedure for pilots about to face serious disciplinary action. Standard procedure for the end of military careers. Warthog 7, "Taxi to Spot 7 and shut down immediately," came the transmission from ground control, officially neutral but carrying undertones that suggested serious trouble ahead. "Do not leave your aircraft. Ground personnel will meet you on arrival." She completed her post-flight checklist with the same methodical precision that had carried her through 2 decades of military service, securing weapons systems and shutting down engines, while the reality of her situation settled around her like a heavy blanket. 23 years of faithful service, an unblemished record, commendations for valor in combat, all of it sacrificed for 8 men she'd found by trusting her instincts over direct orders. The ground crew appeared before her engines had completely spooled down, followed by military police and a delegation of senior officers led by Colonel Hartwell himself. Their faces carried the grim expressions of men tasked with enforcing discipline, maintaining order, and ensuring that military regulations were followed regardless of personal cost. Professional soldiers doing their duty, just as she'd done hers. "Major Restrepo," Hartwell said as she climbed down from the cockpit, "you're under arrest for disobeying direct orders, unauthorized engagement of hostile forces, and violation of rules of engagement. You have the right to remain silent." She listened to the familiar words while the morning sun painted the Hindu Kush mountains in shades of gold and crimson, the same light that had illuminated battlefields for thousands of years. The same sky that had watched Alexander's armies march through these valleys, the same peaks that had witnessed the rise and fall of the British Empire. Afghanistan endured, indifferent to human ambition and the small dramas of military discipline. But somewhere in those mountains, 8 Americans were alive because she'd chosen to trust a single flash of light over direct orders. 8 warriors who would see their families again, hold their children, live the lives that soldiers fight to preserve. That had to count for something, even if military regulations said otherwise. The processing center at Bagram was standard military bureaucracy, forms, statements, formal charges read with legal precision. Colonel Hartwell maintained professional detachment throughout the proceedings, neither hostile nor sympathetic, simply fulfilling his obligations as commanding officer. But something in his eyes suggested that he understood the choice she'd made, even if he couldn't officially approve of it. "Major, you realize this will end your career," he said during a brief recess, his voice carefully neutral. 23 years of service, and you're throwing it away for an unauthorized rescue mission." Catalina met his gaze steadily, seeing past the official disapproval to the warrior underneath. "Colonel, with respect, I didn't throw anything away. I found 8 Americans who needed help and I helped them. That's what we do." The court-martial proceedings began 3 days later in a sterile conference room that smelled of industrial coffee and official disappointment. Military prosecutors presented their case with professional competence, documenting her violations of direct orders and unauthorized combat operations with the thoroughness that characterized all military legal proceedings. The evidence was overwhelming, the charges were legitimate, and the outcome was predetermined. But something unexpected happened during the 3rd day of testimony, when Marcus Rivera took the witness stand. He looked different than she remembered from their radio conversations over the Hindu Kush Valley, older somehow, marked by experiences that hadn't been part of their previous missions together. The same face, the same voice, the same East LA accent, but carrying shadows that suggested stories she didn't know and might never fully understand. "Staff Sergeant Rivera," the prosecutor began, "according to your testimony, you and your team were trapped in hostile territory for 72 hours before Major Restrepo located your position. Can you describe the circumstances that led to your team being reported as killed in action?" Marcus's answer changed everything they thought they knew about the mission, about the impossible radio transmissions, about the 8 Americans who weren't supposed to exist. His words carried the weight of classified operations and political complexities that extended far beyond simple rescue missions in Afghanistan's eastern provinces. "Sir, we were conducting a classified reconnaissance operation when our convoy was hit by an IED," he said, his voice steady but carrying undertones of exhaustion and something that might have been relief. "The explosion destroyed our primary vehicle and damaged our communications equipment. We were forced to operate under EMCON protocols while evading enemy contact for 3 days. EMCON, emission control, radio silence protocols designed to prevent enemy forces from tracking military units through their electronic signatures. It explained the impossible radio transmissions, the delayed contact, the confusion about their operational status. Bravo team hadn't been killed in action. They'd been operating under communications blackout while conducting classified missions that officially didn't exist." The prosecutor pressed for details about the classified operation, but those questions were immediately ruled out of bounds by the military judge. Some stories were too sensitive for court-martial proceedings, too complex for simple questions about following orders and military discipline. Some operations existed in the gray areas between official policy and operational necessity, where warriors did their duty without expecting recognition or understanding. But Marcus Rivera had one more surprise for the court, one final revelation that would change everything about Catalina's case and her understanding of the mission she'd flown. "Sir, there's something else the court needs to know," he said, looking directly at Catalina for the first time since taking the witness stand. "Major Restrepo didn't just save 8 American lives. The intelligence we gathered during our reconnaissance operation has prevented a major terrorist attack on American soil. The mission she enabled has saved thousands of civilian lives." The courtroom fell silent as the implications settled over everyone present. Classified operations prevented terrorist attacks, thousands of American civilians who would never know how close they'd come to catastrophe. The kind of story that would never appear in newspapers or history books, but would be remembered by the intelligence professionals and special operations personnel who understood the true cost of keeping America safe. Colonel Hartwell called a recess while the court considered this new information, and Catalina found herself alone in a hallway that suddenly felt less like a courthouse and more like the kind of place where careers were saved instead of destroyed. She disobeyed direct orders to save 8 Americans, but those 8 Americans had been conducting operations that protected thousands more. The mathematics of military service had always been complicated, but this felt like something beyond mere numbers. When the court reconvened, the military judge's decision reflected the complex realities of modern warfare and the impossible choices that combat pilots faced when choosing between regulations and results. Catalina would face official reprimand for disobeying direct orders, but the charges of unauthorized combat operations would be dropped in consideration of the mission's strategic importance. Her career would continue, marked by controversy but validated by results. But the real vindication came 3 months later, when she received a classified briefing about the terrorist plot that Marcus Rivera's team had uncovered during their reconnaissance mission. The details were too sensitive to discuss, but the scope was breathtaking. A coordinated attack on multiple American cities that would have killed thousands of innocent civilians. The intelligence gathered during those 72 hours in the Afghan mountains had enabled counterterrorism operations that prevented a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. 8 American warriors trapped in a hostile valley, one A-10 pilot willing to risk everything to save them, thousands of American civilians who would never know their names or understand their sacrifice. That was the real mathematics of military service, the equation that balanced individual risk against collective security, personal consequence against national survival. Staff Sergeant Marcus Rivera and his team received classified commendations that would never appear in their official records, recognition for operations that officially never happened. Catalina received the Distinguished Flying Cross for extraordinary heroism in aerial flight, though the citation could only hint at the true scope of her actions. Some stories were too important to tell completely, too sensitive to share with anyone who wasn't bound by the same oaths and obligations. But late at night, when she lay in her quarters listening to the sounds of military aircraft taking off and landing at bases around the world, Catalina sometimes thought about that single flash of light in an Afghan valley. One strobe light, blinking with perfect military precision, leading her to 8 Americans who needed help and enabling operations that protected thousands more. The kind of moment that defined military service, when individual courage and collective mission converged in ways that changed everything. The sky had told the truth, just as her father had promised it would, and she listened,